Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to an informational webinar about updates to the CEQA guidelines hosted by the Sacramento Area Council of Governments and joined with presenters from the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. Just a couple of logistical items to note. All of you are muted right now. If you would like to, and the webinar is being recorded, it will be posted to the SACOG website afterwards. Please send your questions via the question box, which should be in the bottom right-hand side of the control panel that is on your screen. And you can send these questions at any time. We will be following the presentations with a question and answer period. So please ask those via the chat box. Presenting today is Chris Ganson, a senior planner with the Office of Planning and Research. Chris is a senior planner at OPR, where he leads California's transition from LOS to VMT. He previously held positions at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, the World Resources Institute, and U.S. EPA Region 9. Chris holds master's degrees in city planning and transportation engineering from UC Berkeley. Also joining us today is Jeannie Lee, the senior counsel at OPR. Prior to joining OPR, Ms. Lee worked as an attorney at the California Attorney General's Office and Remy Moose Manley, LLP, primarily litigating CEQA and land use cases. Before the legal profession, Ms. Lee was an environmental planner and is a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners. My name is Amy Lee. I'm a research analyst at the Sacramento Area Council of Governments. I'll be moderating today. So just a little bit of background to get us started, and then I'll be handing this over to Jeannie and Chris. There are a few years that have gotten us to this point today, starting with the signing of Senate Bill 743. It was passed and signed in 2013. Several versions of discussion drafts and drafts of proposed revisions to the CEQA guidelines have been circulated over the last few years and have gotten us to the point on Monday, 2 weeks ago today, that a final proposal was released and sent to rulemaking with the Natural Resources Agency. So we're here today to discuss these various documents that have been released. You can find them all here. We'll be talking about the proposed CEQA guidelines. For specifically 743, there's a technical advisory that accompanies those, and then there's a comprehensive package of updates, proposed updates to the CEQA guidelines. And those are all available online at this address and also on the invitation to this webinar. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the presentation over to Jeannie. Go change presenter. Do I need to wait?
And I can just advance it with this. Okay. Thank you very much, Amy, for that introduction, and thank you to SACOG for inviting us for this webinar. So I will be talking about the broader comprehensive package that the proposed changes related to transportation analyses is part of. And Chris Ganson will be focusing in on just the transportation piece. Okay, so this first slide, I'm not going to go in too much detail about the process leading up to November 27th when OPR published the proposed package. Amy gave a great overview of at least the transportation piece. And so I just want to note that from the outset, OPR had considered a broader package of updates. It is the most comprehensive package of proposed updates since the late 1990s, and the transportation piece was on a parallel track with the rest of the comprehensive package. And as Amy mentioned, it went through a progression. This was a very public process. OPR did a number of rounds of drafts of the package and then also solicited public input. And each time we had gotten public input, OPR considered those comments and then made tweaks based on the public input. Okay, so next like I said, I'm going to go over what is in the package. This slide shows generally the three different buckets that characterize the broader package. The three buckets are process improvements, substance improvements, and technical improvements. And here in this slide, I've included just some of the different subject areas that are covered in the proposed update. The comprehensive package, as you probably noticed, is quite large. It's 160 pages, so I definitely encourage all of you to look at it in more detail. So these are just some of the highlights for process improvements. We've covered topics such as the regulatory standards and thresholds, program EIRs, the TOD exemption that already exists in the Public Resources Code. We took a look at Appendix G, modified some of the questions, and then finally remedies and remand, which relate to the litigation side of CEQA. The next bucket includes substance improvements, and these are things that relate to environmental protection specifically. So some topics we covered include energy impacts, water supply, of course, transportation, per Senate Bill 743, and greenhouse gases. And finally, the last bucket includes technical improvements, and these are things that respond to the case law as well as statutory changes. Some topics that you will find under this bucket include baseline, deferred mitigation details, responses to comments, and hazards. So I'm going to go through just some of the high points in this proposed package. And I'm going to start with the scope of program EIRs. So this is a proposed change to section 15168 in the guidelines. And the basic points are that, consistent with case law, the proposal clarifies that whether an activity falls within a program EIR is a factual question that must be supported by substantial evidence. In our proposal, we've also provided a non-exhaustive list of factors that may help an agency determine whether a later activity is within the scope of a program EIR. And these factors that we've listed out have been recognized by the courts as being instructive. They include things such as whether your later project is consistent with allowable land uses or densities or building intensities that have all been described in the project description. Another thing to note is that we have proposed that even if a project is not within the scope, an agency may still streamline the later analysis using the tiering process. So a lead agency can focus the analysis of a later activity on impacts that were not adequately analyzed in the program EIR. Another thing to note that I did not put on this slide is that as to the tiering provisions, which are in section 15152, we've clarified that there are other mechanisms besides tiering to streamline the environmental review. Okay, the next topic that we have covered include energy impacts. So this is a change to section 15126.2. So Appendix F, as you likely know, currently includes a requirement stating that an EIR must look at the energy impacts caused by a project. So while this Appendix F has existed for quite some time in the CEQA guidelines, implementation of it has not been consistent, as we've found. So our proposal includes a new subdivision to address specifically energy impacts and to really just highlight it and bring it into greater focus. You may be aware that recent case law has also elevated the issue of energy impacts. Those cases, there are two cases that came out very close in time to each other. One involves the city of Ukiah, the other one involves the city of Woodland, both dealing with large scale retail. So with this proposal, we have clarified, or we're proposing to clarify, that an EIR must analyze and mitigate environmental impacts due to wasteful, inefficient, or unnecessary consumption of energy. So that phrase, due to wasteful, inefficient, or unnecessary energy consumption, that actually comes from Appendix F, we have now proposed to bring it into section 15126.2, as well as we've also proposed questions in Appendix G. Something important to note is that there still must be causation, meaning that the project must have caused the environmental impacts resulting from the wasteful, inefficient, or unnecessary use of energy. The analysis here should also include energy use for all project phases, and also include transportation-related energy. Those two cases I mentioned before, coming from Ukiah and Woodland, those specifically raise the transportation-related energy issue. The proposal also states that relevant considerations when you're looking at a energy impacts analysis include project size, location. It can also include whether your project includes renewable energy features. And finally, we've proposed a rule of reason. So agencies should be focusing really on the project energy's demand. A life cycle analysis may not generally be required for your project. So the next piece is the transportation piece. This piece has undoubtedly gotten a lot of attention. And like I said, Chris Ganson will be taking a deeper dive into it. Currently, as you likely all know, the metric for transportation analysis is the level of service metric. With Bill 743, which was passed and signed into law in 2013, it specifically directed OPR to update the CEQA guidelines and come up with an alternative metric, basically something other than LOS that promoted GHG reductions, aligned with our statewide goals for GHG reductions, and an alternative metric that also promoted infill development and multimodal streets. So the legislature specifically suggested as an alternative metric the vehicle miles traveled metric, but it also required OPR to go through a public process and determine what was the best metric before making a formal decision. Once the new guidelines are adopted, automobile delay and congestion will no longer be considered an environmental impact. So with all of this in mind, what does the new section or guideline proposal look like? So this slide just shows the main points of that proposed section. The new section is 15064.3. VMT is the proposed primary metric. There are two presumptions that are in this new proposed section. For land use projects specifically, we've included a presumption of less than significant if the development is near transit or if the project reduces VMT. For transportation projects, there's also a similar presumption of less than significant for VMT reducing projects. Other components of the proposal include that the lead agency may analyze VMT qualitatively if existing models or methods are not available, and agencies have the discretion to choose the most appropriate methodology to analyze a project's VMT, including by expressing that VMT as an absolute number or per capita or per employee. Finally, there will be, we've proposed an opt-in period to prepare for the transition, and statewide application will begin January 1st, 2020. So some other points that I just want to note here is that Senate Bill 743, which is actually in Public Resources Code Section 21099, also specified that other transportation-related impacts such as air quality and GHG still need to be analyzed. And also with this proposed metric of VMT, lead agencies can still use LOS in their planning, and also for their feed programs. Okay, so the next section that I'll cover is the proposed change to the greenhouse gas emissions section, which is in 15064.4 of the guidelines. A few things to note here. Subdivision A of that section currently includes a statement stating that the lead agency should make a good faith effort to analyze a project's GHG emissions. With our proposal, we have proposed to replace the word should with shall to clarify that the analysis of GHG emissions is, in fact, a CEQA requirement. We have clarified in our proposal that the lead agency's analysis should be on the project's effect on climate change and not just focus on how the quantity of emissions compares to statewide or global emissions. Our proposal also includes that the analysis should consider a time frame that is appropriate for the project, and recognizing that there are many different kinds of projects. So the time frame that is appropriate for the project should be considered. Also, we have proposed that the analysis must reasonably reflect evolving scientific knowledge, and that language comes from a recent case. It's the Sandag case that the Supreme Court had come out with earlier this summer. Okay, next, baseline. This is a proposed change to section 15125. The first change that we're proposing is a statement about the purpose of the baseline, which is essentially to give agencies the most accurate picture of the project impacts. So the general rule about baseline and the appropriate baseline is that the existing conditions are normally the baseline, and those are existing conditions that are measured at the time the agency puts out the NOP, or if there is no NOP, so we have in our proposal stated that agencies may use other baselines in addition to the existing conditions. Here we've also taken a look at a most recent case law, namely the Neighbors for Smart Rail case, and the other case is escaping me right now. CBIA or CBE versus South Coast South Coast AQMD. I'm totally butchering that name. I apologize. So our proposed changes directly relate to those cases. So we've also stated that lead agencies can use an alternative baseline when the existing conditions baseline would be misleading, and there's substantial evidence to support using that alternative baseline. Also from the CBE versus South Coast AQMD case, we stated, we proposed that agencies cannot use a hypothetical baseline and cannot measure project impacts against conditions that are neither existing nor historic. The next section that I'll cover is section 15126.4. This section relates to the deferral of mitigation. Here in our proposal, we've clarified that the agency shall not defer mitigation, and this has been made very clear in numerous cases. Other points that I'd like to point out here, we have clarified situations when deferral of specific mitigation details may be permissible under CEQA, namely those situations include when it is impractical or infeasible to include specific details during the environmental review, and where the agency commits itself to the mitigation, adopts performance standards, and lists potential mitigation measures. And again, these are all principles that have trickled up through the case law. The next section is hazards. This change is proposed in section 15126.2 subdivision A. So here, our proposed change is that section 15126.2 would require EIRS to analyze significant impacts that the project might cause or risk exacerbating. So we've now proposed to include that phrase, or risk exacerbating, into this sentence that says, the EIR shall also analyze any significant environmental effects the project might cause by bringing development and people into the area affected. This specific change implements the court's direction in CBIA versus Bay Area Air Quality Management District. So by making this change, this proposal clarifies that an EIR should not just consider existing hazards, but also consider the potential for increasing the severity of hazards over time. In other words, the potential for making conditions worse. So that is the last section that I will cover. Moving forward, as Amy said, 2 weeks ago, OPR had published the proposal. We've submitted that proposal to the Resources Agency. So we're now finished with the first step. As you can see, there are 2 more steps before the proposed CEQA guidelines become official. So right now we're in the second stage here. The Resources Agency will be putting out a notice of proposed action or notice of proposed rulemaking, and that document will kick off the formal public comment period. The public comment period must be a minimum of 45 days under the Administrative Procedure Act. During that time, the public will be encouraged to submit their comments to the Resources Agency. Resources will then review the comments. They will prepare written responses, and depending on the substance of those changes, the Resources Agency may need to or decide to propose changes, and that may, again, depending on the nature of those changes, there may be an additional public review period that will be between 15 and 45 days. So after that process is done, the Resources Agency will publish a document called the Final Statement of Reasons, and that document will be submitted to the Office of Administrative Law. From that point, OAL will have 30 working days to review the final package to ensure that it is consistent and meets all the requirements of the Administrative Procedure Act. Once all the boxes have been checked and OAL has finished its review, OAL files the CEQA guidelines with the Secretary of State for inclusion into the California Code of Regulations, which is where the CEQA guidelines currently are. We invite you to stay up to date with this process as Resources Agency moves forward. On the OPR website, under the CEQA Guidelines tab, you can find a place to sign up on the OPR listserv as well as the Resources Agency listserv. And that is all I have.
Okay, great. So this is Chris Ganson here, and I'm going to take a deeper dive on the transportation metrics portion of the CEQA guidelines change that is pursuant to SB 743, aside from the portion of 743 that takes care of streamlining the arena, which we've already got in the ground and we're watching Kings games in. Okay, so first I want to start with the fact that probably every single person on the watching this webinar, and certainly myself, has been in an automobile before and been behind other automobiles in congestion and been annoyed about the slowdown that's resulted from those other automobiles. And so it's no surprise that we have developed metrics of auto delay, and that they become really the primary metrics by which we've measured our transportation systems. I'm going to assume that most of the folks on the phone are familiar with LOS, so I'm just going to briefly describe it. It's an A through F grade given to intersections or roadway segments. For intersections, it's by how much delay is on the at the intersection. So if you're more delayed getting through the intersection, the automobile is more delayed getting through the intersection, you get a worse grade. So that has led to a list really of less than ideal outcomes, which I'm going to run through briefly before turning to describe the metric we are moving toward. Jeannie mentioned it already, vehicle miles traveled. I'm describing some of the benefits of that and then getting into a few of the details of measurement in different project types and such. So one of the problems that was raised to us with LOS is that this is the sort of this is what success looks like, even though there's not really much of anywhere to go here, and this is what failure looks like, even though in this case, it's one of the most economically productive streets in the state. One consistent concern we heard raised was what LOS did to infill development. Here is an infill development in just a schematic of a city. Infill tends to load relatively little vehicle travel onto the network, but trigger lots of LOS impacts because it's last in development by definition, and the development that's there before has filled those intersections up close to LOS threshold, leaving that last in, that infill development to push those intersections over. That requires the infill development to fund mitigation, which puts it at a disadvantage compared to other development. It also requires that mitigation to be auto-serving over all else, and that disadvantages the infill development in that it makes it is great for traffic passing through its neighborhood, but it makes the streets less walkable, bikeable, and livable. Meanwhile, applying LOS to outlying projects, which tend to load 3 or 4 times as typical the amount of vehicle travel onto the roadway network, tend to trigger proportionately fewer LOS impacts. And that's just because the traffic generated by those projects is dispersed enough by the time it reaches congested areas that it doesn't trigger LOS thresholds, even though it contributes broadly to regional congestion. Getting to the core of an issue with LOS and with metrics of automobile delay in general is this illustration, which is better, a 45-minute commute including 5 minutes of congestion or a 20-minute commute including 10 minutes of congestion. Well, of course, LOS says the 45-minute commute is better because it's only looking at that 5 minutes of congestion, nothing else. But we know, of course, that the 20-minute commute represents better accessibility. Accessibility is a word in transportation used for the ability of people to get to places, and which we consider the point of the fundamental purpose and point of transportation. A couple other diagrams briefly to illustrate that. Here's a 25-year look at the Denver area that did a lot of infill development over this time, and if they were to measure their progress using a measure of automobile delay, like the one in the last line just above the clocks, they would think they'd done terrible because delay went up by a factor of 2.5. But in fact, the average travel time went down a bit. So the measure of access, the measure of how well people can get to places, can actually move opposite the measure of automobile delay. Another example, this one compares Charlotte and Chicago. Charlotte, the average commute is 48 minutes, including 9.6 minutes of delay. In Chicago, it's 32.5 minutes or so, including 9.8 minutes of delay. So that would make Chicago seem to be the worst place for a commute, even though from an access perspective, from getting somewhere to getting to your destination perspective, Chicago is clearly better. I won't mention it for all the slides, but I've included the technical reports and academic research links if you want to go back to the presentation, which I understand will be made available to you in recording and perhaps the slides also. You can follow those links and dig deeper into these. There's a recent study out of UCLA, and this study looks at the relative contribution of mobility, which is essentially vehicle speed, and proximity, how close people are, how close residences, for example, are to destinations. And this graph illustrates the point I've been making in another way that I think is important. The left graph shows on the x-axis the jobs that are near, how many jobs are nearby. So the further you go along the x-axis, the more jobs. And on the y-axis, the vertical axis, you see the job accessibility score, how many jobs you can get to. And it's no surprise that the more jobs that there are nearby, in this case within a 6-mile radius, the more jobs you can get to. That's intuitive. And it might also be intuitive that the faster you could go, the more jobs you could get to. But in fact, the faster you can go in your neighborhood in a 6-mile radius, the fewer jobs you could get to. That's because in order to keep traffic flowing, it's necessary to reduce density. And it turns out that the additional distance you need to go, the worsening of proximity, has a bigger effect than the increase of speed. And these results were robust over a couple different studies using the same factors. The study authors pointed out that for compact and location-efficient development, the time lost to commuter traffic delays, that's due to extra congestion, is offset by the greater opportunities to reach destinations over shorter distances to which the development densities give rise. And more pointedly, the myopic focus on traffic impacts of new developments, and that's exactly using LOS in CEQA, is misguided and may actually decrease accessibility and economic activity in an effort to protect traffic flows. So that means that this is not a matter of transportation versus environment. LOS is actually, in the big picture, harming success in transportation, success in getting people to places. Here, in case you're curious, is the relationship between traffic delay and GDP in American metros. There are a couple other issues around using LOS that were raised to us that I wanted to pass along. One is that using LOS is expensive, as you probably all know, and as you may or may not know, it's not very accurate. In order to calculate LOS, you need to first calculate the volume, traffic volume incident at each intersection you're analyzing, and we only can get that information to plus or minus a third or so. So that might be a letter grade or two off, even though we see delay measures reported sometimes to 4 decimal points. We really know them to not 1 decimal point, but plus or minus a third or so. That fixing LOS, that relieving a bottleneck, simply moves congestion elsewhere, certainly from a regional perspective and even from oftentimes a city perspective. There's 2 reasons for that. One is that if first and foremost we're accommodating automobile traffic, that's going to advantage the automobile over other modes and lead to more automobile travel. That extra automobile travel is going to spill out beyond the area that has been mitigated by a project, because the trip lengths are not going. There's no project that's mitigating LOS in a radius of the average trip length of 5 or 10 miles, just mitigating close to the project. So that traffic will spill out onto the regional roadway network where it causes congestion. Another issue is that when you relieve a bottleneck, that traffic can go downstream and worsen or create another bottleneck, and that can be even worse than the first bottleneck was. That's something called Bray's paradox, and you might think that's a very arcane and probably happens once in a blue moon, but in fact it happens fairly often, and in fact we use that approach intentionally in some cases in ramp metering. That's what we're doing. We're creating a bottleneck on the ramp to preserve the main line flow. When we use LOS in the CEQA context, we apply LOS more willy-nilly and sometimes lead to worse traffic conditions by relieving bottlenecks and creating new ones. That's led to a cascade of other effects from LOS. This first one I've mentioned already, that it has disadvantages infill and therefore leads to more outlying development. It inhibits transit and active transportation. Transit projects frequently find themselves having to do backflips, even though transit vehicles may hold 10 or 20 or 40, or in the case of light rail, hundreds of people. They may find themselves having to do these projects backflips to accommodate cars holding 1 or 2 people. Active transportation, meanwhile, cyclists and pedestrians are impediments to transportation according to LOS rather than transportation in their own right. It forces us to lay down pavement to accommodate auto traffic, and it's often the case that we haven't identified sufficient funds to maintain the pavement we already have. It generates an array of environmental impacts because that additional vehicle travel, in addition to causing more direct impacts like greenhouse gases and regional pollutants and transportation energy use from the tailpipe of the vehicles, also leads to less efficient land use development, leading to greater building energy use, and water use, laying down more impermeable surfaces, which create more runoff and flooding hazard and pollutant transport to waterways, and also that consume more open space, including sensitive habitat and agricultural land. It's also unhelpful to health because more driving means more crashes and less biking and walking, and I'll come back to that in a moment about the benefits we can get from sending those factors in the right direction. So in sum, there's no question that automobility is going to be key to transportation in California for the foreseeable future. However, holding new development responsible for mitigating LOS impacts slows beneficial development, harms the economy, renders non-auto modes unviable, harms health, harms the environment, is unaffordable, and in the big picture, it doesn't help overall auto mobility, ironically. Jeannie already mentioned that we're shifting to vehicle miles traveled as a metric of transportation impact under CEQA, and I want to talk a little bit about the benefits that will create. First off, transit-oriented development, which was difficult or stunted often using LOS, is completely streamlined using VMT as a metric. In fact, our guidance says if you're within a half mile of transit, don't even do a transportation analysis, don't even bother to calculate your VMT. It's likely to be low, so take a presumption that it's that you don't need to even analyze it. The same is true for a large swaths of infill development in the existing urban fabric. So we're encouraging maps to be made by jurisdictions or regions that essentially paint the areas that are below the significance threshold, say green, and make those go zones for development. Make those areas we recommend are presumed less than significant for transportation impacts as well. So the area around transit and the area the area of infill that would be streamlined, it might seem that would represent a small portion of future development, but in fact, I don't have the numbers for CEQA. The Southern California Association of Governments analyzed what fraction of their future residential development would be so streamlined. Streamlined meaning it would not even need to do any sort of analysis, any sort of transportation impact analysis, and that they found that 56% of future residential development wasn't going to need any sort of analysis. So these streamlining opportunities are really pretty substantial. In addition, transit projects, because they reduce VMT, receive a presumption under our recommendations of less than significance. Same with active transportation projects. And same with locally serving retail projects, because locally serving retail projects tend to provide destinations in the urban fabric that essentially add to the places people can go to buy things and get services. So they tend to reduce the amount of vehicle travel. So we're recommending no need to analyze them so long as they're verified that they're locally serving. For the remaining sorts of projects, the 1 through 5 represent quite a substantial portion of projects, but the remaining projects, modeling VMT rather than LOS, will find the modeling quite a bit easier. And the reason for this is for modeling VMT, essentially you need the trip length and you need the number of trips generated from a project, the average trip length and the number of trips generated, and that gives you the answer to VMT. You don't need to study what's going to happen at a whole number of different intersections. You don't need to look at those intersections and do microsimulation modeling. The modeling has looked like we've actually done some case studies ourselves. Some case studies are contained in the last release in January 2016, which is still up on our website. Feel free to take a look. And we used Kali Mod in that case. There's that and other free downloadable models that are fairly easy to get ramped up on. There are also cities currently having models developed by consultants that there is certainly a cost to developing the model, but once developed, they're finding that project applicants can just put in their own data oftentimes, and it's quite easy to get the VMT assessment out the other end of it. As consultants have been talking to me about they're worried they're putting themselves out of business because the models are so easy to use, they're not sure they're going to be needed. Another benefit is that VMT mitigation compared to LOS mitigation attacks regional congestion more effectively because you reduce the amount of vehicle travel at the source rather than accommodating it locally and spilling over regionally. For VMT mitigation, you're not going to lay down more pavement, so you're not going to exacerbate your future pavement maintenance deficits. There are potentially fairly massive public health improvements available as an outcome of this shift. This is because today we see over 21,000 deaths per year attributable in California to physical inactivity, and our California Department of Public Health has analyzed what the effects would be of achieving our mode share targets, increasing biking, walking, and transit use. Transit use involves usually a bike or walk trip to the transit station on one or both ends. And they found that achieving those mode share targets would save 2,100 lives per year here in California. If you monetize that, depending on the method you use and the completeness of that assessment, you get between $1 and $15 billion a year in prevented premature death and disability. Those are really substantial numbers. In fact, folks in public health are saying that that's probably the biggest thing that public health can do today. And SB 743 and the shift in mitigating VMT and the extent to which that gets people, provides facilities for biking and walking and gets people biking and walking, it will play a really substantial role in this. And last but not least, reducing VMT aligns with rather than contradicts our efforts to reduce greenhouse gases and other emissions. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that briefly, but for a few sides. We've all watched this fall as hurricanes have hit the East Coast. This photograph is after Houston was hit and submerged in before Florida and Puerto Rico and other islands in the Caribbean were hit. And here's a map of the West. This is in September. These are the wildfires that were present at that time. Of course, this is before the Napa conflagration and the current still burning Southern California conflagrations. Just saw those last night from the airplane. Where are the greenhouse gases coming from? As climate scientists have been saying for quite some time that these sorts of effects, increased hurricane activity, increased wildfires, would be exactly the sorts of effects we'd see from climate change. So we're really seeing a start to that happening. Transportation is half of the greenhouse gas emissions in California once you count oil and gas extraction and petroleum refining. And the pipelines to transport that. So we can't get there from here without really focusing on transportation. State policy currently gets us to the gray line, the one labeled baseline. This is from the AB 32, SB 32 scoping plan. And we'll need to do quite a bit more because we need to get down to that green line in order to stay within what we need, what science says we need to do in order not to lead to the worst impacts of climate change. And that'll involve really ramping up zero emissions vehicle sales, ramping up cleaning the electrical grid. And as we do that, but even doing those and cranking those levers as far as we can, the Air Resources Board is saying we're going to need to contain vehicle miles traveled to about 7.5% below what current policies get us, and that's what all the SCSs currently get us for 2035, and 15% below that for 2050. So we're going to have to contain VMT. Here is a chart again from the Air Resources Board. The right two bars show the targets, the SB 375 targets that the MPOs are recommending, and the rightmost, the targets that staff is proposing. And here's where we need to be for VMT in order to hit our carbon targets. So there's quite a bit more than is on the table right now under SB 375. 743 is going to have to kick in and make up this difference. And just another slide to point a little bit out of what's at stake here. This is a picture I took camping with a couple friends and their kids this summer, and I reflected that these guys who are on the ground today are going to be 35 in 2050 and 85 in 2100. And we know from climate science that over that period, 2050 to 2100, is when the effects of climate change are really going to ramp up if we do not act. If we do not act, what they see will make what we're seeing this past fall look like peanuts. It's not all doom and gloom, though. We have the opportunity using low VMT development to take the urban fabric that we have and make it into the sort of urban fabric that a lot of people are excited to live in. And I don't say I don't point to the demand for living in walkable and bikeable neighborhoods lightly. There's real estate research at this point that's replicated, showing fairly clearly that there's way more people who would take a small backyard for a walkable neighborhood than there are residences in walkable neighborhoods. So we need to build more walkable neighborhoods in order to provide the sort of living that a lot of people are looking for. The last research I heard on CEQA was that all the large lot development that was needed in 2035 is already on the ground today. But there's quite a bit of unmet demand for walkable neighborhoods, and low VMT development is exactly what retrofits those that are existing higher VMT neighborhoods into more walkable neighborhoods, and will provide that and hopefully help with should help with reducing housing costs, which have become expensive in these sorts of neighborhoods as there's so much demand for them. Wanted to talk through briefly what the sort of three cases of significance for 743, and this is generally for CEQA, but it's important to point out for projects under 743. There will be those that I mentioned that are streamlined. Those will be quite large in number. There will also be those that are not streamlined. They're higher than the significance level to begin with, but they can be mitigated down to less than significant. That's I'm capturing in the second item there. And there'll be those which are more than significant, and mitigation will reduce VMT somewhat, but not to less than significance. And those projects will still move forward with statements of overriding consideration. The VMT reduction, the streamlining and the increase in VMT efficient development that the first provides, and the VMT mitigation that arise from the second and third will all be important to us achieving both our greenhouse gas emissions targets and a lot of other objectives here at various levels of government, from state down to local. So what to do outside of CEQA? Well, we're recommending in the general plan guidelines not using LOS for transportation impact studies. That means not having a development mitigate its own LOS impacts as a general practice. And in the space from having made that transition, stepping back and thinking, envisioning what kind of city or region do you or your constituents want, and then thinking what sort of transportation infrastructure forwards that vision, and to the extent that you need impact fees from development to pay for it, base those on the amount of vehicle travel they load onto the network, rather than LOS. We're also recommending looking at how well transportation projects improve access to destinations. In other words, how well they get people to places rather than how much automobile delay they reduce, which, as I've shown in the previous slides, is not always the same thing. I'll point out that the state of Virginia is already using measures of access to destinations to measure their projects, so the tools are on the ground. I'll finish with a few thoughts about transportation projects, roadway capacity expansion projects in particular. I want to point out that a roadway capacity project increases vehicle travel. It's a phenomenon called induced vehicle travel in five different component causal pathways. It creates longer trips, mode shift towards automobile, sometimes newly generated trips. That isn't such a concern in this region because it's a concern in more highly congested regions like the Bay Area and Los Angeles and Southern California. It changes routes, which can increase or decrease the amount of vehicle travel. And importantly, it changes land use development patterns and makes them more dispersed, and that leads in turn to more vehicle travel. So just a quick think through in CEQA. You have an impact assessment and a significance determination, and for a roadway capacity project, it's important to get the induced travel analysis right, because it's the basis of what the impacts will be. And you can see impacts that are affected by the amount of vehicle travel include greenhouse gas emissions and other air pollutants, noise, transportation. I didn't put energy up here, but that's one, and then the transportation by whatever metric you're measuring it. In order to get the induced travel analysis right, you need to get that land use, the assessment of the effect, the land use effects of the transportation project right. Those land use effects also, of course, also have their own impacts. And the key change that 743 makes is really the metric of transportation. So the change in the guidelines from our previous release, the transportation roadway capacity projects may use vehicle miles traveled, but they also may use automobile level of service standards. However you measure your transportation impacts, it's important to get the analysis behind it, make that as accurate as possible. For those who have been following this process, I wanted to point out what the changes were, and I mentioned one of them just now, the change to the guidelines. The use of vehicle miles traveled is optional for highway capacity projects. Changes to the technical advisory, we're recommending that you don't need to analyze freight VMT. You can if it's easier to, but you don't need to. Only the number of, if you are, so a residential project, we're recommending look at the regional average minus 15%, so 85% of the regional average, or 85% of the city average for high VMT cities. If you're a high VMT city, we're now recommending not using your 85% of your city average for more than the number of residential units that the SCS that are in your city in the SCS. Mixed-use projects we're recommending may examine just the dominant use, or may, as we previously recommended, examine all the uses and compare to the relevant thresholds. For projects going where there are existing projects already generating existing VMT, we're recommending that if there is a net decrease in VMT, that's less than significant impact. Otherwise, we recommend to use the methods we've recommended previously. We've revised the small project threshold. That's the threshold below which you need not analyze VMT in our recommendations, but we've only revised it a bit, not a big change. And we recommend studying a reduced VMT alternative per that recently published Sandag case. So I am going to stop there. I want to thank CEQA and Amy in particular for holding this. It's great for us to be able to reach out with this information to you. On the screen is our SB 743 key resources page. Each of those gray horizontal gray bars expands out and has a number of resources in it. Please peruse, and there's some good resources in there. And I'll stop. I see that we are right near the end of our time. Maybe we can go over a few for questions.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris and Jeannie. We are bumping up right to the end of our time, but we'll field a few questions that we have received so far. One is a question around if OPR has any sort of specific guidance on how to conduct key energy analyses.
OPR does not have anything such as a technical advisory, but one place for guidance to look is directly at Appendix F. There are a number of questions there that can guide the analysis. Another place to look at are the cases that I mentioned earlier. It's it's California Clean Energy Commission versus City of Woodland, and then the other one is I just had it, Ukiah Citizens for Safety First versus City of Ukiah.
And we do have recommendations on assessing vehicle travel underpinning those energy analyses. and those are in our technical advisory. There's also resources on our website that I just pointed out that go to that. The one that comes to mind immediately is the CAPCOA has a greenhouse gas emissions guide, but that essentially you could use those methods for energy assessment as well for transportation. Actually, they go beyond transportation in that document.
Great. A question about a definition of regional. Is there a definition of regional as it relates to the recommended threshold?
Yeah, simply for this region, it'd be the CEQA region.
Okay. And elsewhere, or let's say Placer County or? Right,
county average.
Okay.
Yeah, county. Though for rural counties, we don't have. We recommend developing thresholds on a case-by-case basis, because there are many situations. Small towns in rural counties actually perform very efficiently on VMT, but of course there are rural uses that inevitably need to be far from their destination, from other destinations, and therefore inherently generate a lot of VMT. So we recommend a case-by-case threshold development there.
Okay. A question about how would a lead agency, is there anything in the technical advisory about how a lead agency would determine the dominant use for a mixed-use project?
We don't. We leave that up to the lead agency, and if the lead agency wants to be really careful, they can still analyze all of the uses. In many mixed-use projects, there'll be a presumption for each of the uses of lessened significance, so it'll be really easy. But we wanted to offer the option to, if there's a clearly dominant land use, to just look at that one.
Great. Okay, let's see. One back to Jeannie. The time frame it was from your earlier presentation, the time frame referring to the anticipated operational year.
It looks like this question is just generally asking about the proposed change about the time frame under the GHG emissions analysis.
Right.
And so we've included this proposal to just acknowledge that CEQA generally pivots towards short-term and long-term impacts. In some cases, it would be appropriate for an agency to consider a project's long-term GHG emissions, such as for projects with long time horizons for implementation. In some cases, certain projects may just have a very short time frame. So we're just proposing that agencies, or rather we're acknowledging that every project may be different.
Mm-hmm. Great. I think this might be our last question here, but one about any inclusion of regional transportation plans being impacted by these guidelines updates.
We did not provide in the current draft recommendations on assessment of VMT assessment of regional transportation plans. So we actually stepped back from that for this latest draft.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, thank you, Chris Ganson and Jeannie Lee. All of our email addresses are on the screen. Feel free to ask us questions. If you'd like to contact CEQA about any of these, please feel free to contact myself, alee@cecog.org. And we thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.